Alright, so one other thing that you can do, in terms of sort of cleverly laying out your UVs is, so like if I have this nice cabinet door from this like weird cabinet door sort of demo thing I did a few days ago, I could cut this up in such a way that the UVs, I basically wouldn't need to do anything to the texture itself. I wouldn't need to ever go into Photoshop, and it would just be a nice looking texture. So let me see really quick if I actually have any wood file or wood textures in here. I do not. Okay. 2H Dry Haven textures. Tra la la. Okay, you know what? Google it is. Cool. Wood texture. For the purposes of this demo, kind of like shrugs. If you ever wanted to find one that you were definitely sure you had usage rights for, you would totally want to go in and find. I'll do this. This is like looks like a good example. Okay, sure. It's covered in watermarks, but whatever for the sake of this demonstration. Actually, I have a video about this. Wood text. But you can go up and actually search by usage rights. If you go to tools, usage rights, you could do like labeled for reuse with modification, whatever, pretty much whatever you were needing to use. Actually, in this case, I found this nice one with less watermarks. So I'm just gonna wood text 2. Cool. So, let's put those, yeah. Alright, so I'm going to grab that wood texture. Again, just hit 6 to actually apply it. And you'll notice that because of the way I made this object, which is basically to start with a cube and extrude these corners in, the wood grain on the side looks reasonable. It's a very low quality image for what I'm looking for. But the grain is like kind of, at least looks like wood grain, but up here it's like really janky and terrible looking. So what I do probably in this case is my goal. So if you look at a cabinet, cabinet door, and this is the kind of stuff that I want you guys to be thinking of. Sure, let's go to cabinetdoormart.com. But you'll notice that, and they kind of do it differently depending on the door. But like this top strip here, can I just click on this? Okay, this top strip here has the wood running horizontally. These vertical strips have it running vertically, etc. And that's just a function of how doors are made. In this case, I'm assuming it was a little bit more of a quality door, and they actually did like a 45-degree mitered edge. They totally didn't, but that's fine. So what I'm going to do in this case, since I have these 45-degree angles pretty much built into the model itself because of the way that I made it, I'm just going to come up here, grab these guys, pull up my UV editor, and I'm just going to go to cut. Now you'll notice that my UVs look absolutely terrible. These are just the default square UVs for Maya's default square cube that it puts in your scene. So I'm just going to unfold this really quick and see what horrors happen. Hey, it's actually not too bad. You'll see here that I have now the UVs are at least, I have the detail on the top of this cube at least, so that when I look at it, it does have at least a wood grain texture on the surface. So what I'm going to do is just go back in. I will chop these edges apart. Again, if you click on the edges in the UV editor only, it doesn't work if you click it in the viewport and then go into the editor. You have to click it in the UV editor. I should be able to do Shift X, and that will actually cut those edges apart. And I also just want to do this with these edges in here. I'll just do Shift X, and now I should have separate UV shells for all of these faces and pretty much most of the sides of my cube. What I'm actually going to do now is just go back and stitch some of the sides of the cube back together. And to do that, you should be able to do, I think it's Shift V? Actually, no. Shift C? I forget exactly what the hotkey is, but there's a hotkey for that. But in this case, it actually doesn't do what I want. It's going to do a sew function. So this is what the hotkey would do. It would do sew, which if I look at this UV shell, you can see now that my UVs are like overlapping super weird. If I unfold this, it then does something more like what I actually maybe want it to. Usually my preferred tool is Move and Sew, and that'll just sort of wrong edge, and that'll just attach things kind of better. But anyway, so onto the actual top of this, which is the reason that I was showing you guys this. If I decided, like, here's the front of my object, the wood grain on this panel and this panel is running the wrong way. So if I actually just rotated this like 90 degrees like this, and then did the same thing here, I'm just holding down J to snap in 15-degree increments. And then I could go in if I wanted to and like lay these out like this. And this is just an example of like laying out your UVs efficiently so that they use as much of the space as possible. So I'll just scale these guys up. Probably a bad idea, but whatever. But anyway, so you can see that with some really pretty easy work in terms of doing UVs, I have a cabinet where all the wood grain is laid out in the correct direction. It's actually a really ugly wood texture. Let's see. Okay, this is also a really ugly wood texture, but I guess you get the point. I'll go back to the other one. At least have the grain in the right direction. I will, however, turn on this. Maybe it makes it slightly easier for you guys to see. So then I can do the same thing on the sides if I wanted to. I could go through, let's chop those apart, and I could just rotate these until the wood grain was in the direction that I expected. And I could just go around and pretty much do that for all of the sides. And then you would have a texture that pretty much did what you want. So this was like also one of the circumstances where, like, normally it's not great to have your UVs overlapping, but in this case, if you wanted to just sort of throw them like randomly around a little bit, and again, other teachers will totally yell at you if you do this, and if you had to add any kind of grime to this, it would be bad, but since this is just a wood grain, like if this is all I want out of my texture, I could, shift these around until I found patterns of grain that I liked on the texture itself. So if I found like, oh, I really like this sort of knotted area over here, I could grab like the center of the cabinet and be like, cool, I'm gonna put that little knotted area in the center of the cabinet. And you can just kind of like fiddle with stuff that way. Again, a lot of times it's not good to have your UVs overlap like this. And if you were adding any kind of like grime in here or like stains to this past the wood texture, you wouldn't want to do this. But if you're just like looking for a random cabinet to be sort of in the background of your scene, like this would be totally fine. So the other thing that I wanted to kind of point out, is like right now, clearly this model is not meant to be smooth at all. It does actually look kind of cooler with the texture on it, but you can see the smooths really, really badly. But maybe I wanted to like get up and close in here, and you can see that it's like kind of low poly, and there's still like a bunch of little bumps in here. So one thing I'll do actually many times, because I'm kind of lazy, I'll smooth my model after I UV it, just so I don't need to deal with having the extra edge loops there and like selecting the wrong ones. So if you just go into Mesh Tools, Insert Edge Loop Tool, I can just come up here and add in a few loops to harden these edges out. And again, I have like a specific video about this in somewhere. So I'm not going to go over like exactly what I'm doing to harden this. But hopefully you kind of get the point. So like once that's been hardened, you can see that I have like pretty reasonable looking there we go. Pretty reasonable looking, good lord, textures on this. And they'll have like those nice sort of 45-degree cuts at the end, as if it were a cabinet that were actually physically assembled like this. So one thing you will notice when you smooth models, if you smooth your model, wherever there's like a UV seam, you're going to get this weird sort of pulling in your texture, which is almost impossible to avoid. You can help by adding in extra edge loops. So right here I don't have an edge loop to harden the bottom. So if I just hit G to go back to my insert edge loop tool, throw another edge loop in, and you can see that it totally helps with the stretching, but there's still a little bit of stretching there. Again, it's kind of just like an unfortunate, you can add, if you add in another edge loop, like right, so I have basically two holding edge loops at the bottom. Sometimes that'll also help with the stretching, but it's certainly not guaranteed, and it's also sometimes harder to add in that second loop. And you can see like up here, it's also pulling, and that is even after, so that's after I added the first edge loop in. If I were to add a second one, again, it helps a little bit with the stretching. And then, like, same thing up here, there's a little bit of texture stretching. So you could add in that second extra loop if you wanted to. And you can see, so if I'll pull up my UV editor, as I added the loops to this object, the loops are actually added to the UVs themselves. So the insert edge loop tool is 100% not something that's going to damage your UVs. It's just going to add, you can see the pulling here. It's just going to add loops and like draw them through your UVs. So I did one like in the middle. You'll see that there's now more lines in my UVs. So like I said, a lot of times I will totally smooth my model after a UV just because it makes my life ever so slightly easier, I think. But it really doesn't matter. The things that will affect your UVs, so I'll grab my original model again, go back to here. So anything where you're like adding in new geometry, so like if I were to grab this face here, you'll see, so if you look at this face in the UV editor, so I'll do an extrude on this, and I'll just take that face and scale it down. You'll notice that the texture looks like butt. And that is because basically this whole ring of faces in here are new faces, and the UV editor does not show you what the heck to do with that. So if I smooth this object, you'll see that the faces are there. They're in the UV editor. And you can see the texture actually looks a little bit different when you smooth it too. But if I go into my unsmooth mode, there's pretty much just like edges on top of edges. So it's basically taking a flat strip of pixels and stretching it to be however long that face is, which is why you get that sort of stripey effect. Theoretically, if I were to go to UV shell, modify, unfold, it would do better things to that face. So that's definitely something to be aware of. UVing, definitely UV when you're pretty much done with the basic shape of your model. You don't need to go back in and like add more stuff for shaping or anything like that. Speaking of shaping, if I were to just grab this vertex here and be like, oh no, it's not quite in the right position. Like if I drag this around, that is going to affect how the texture displays, because, where is this vert? Alright, yeah, so that's like the vert on this part of the bottom of the texture. So you're moving the vertice, but you're not changing the UVs, so it's basically having to take this same texture displayed on this area here and stretch it to fit this new larger shape of the polygon. If you wanted to correct that, you could do an unfold. You could also just sort of try to manually modify the UVs in some way, shape, or form. I would recommend just doing an unfold, or just get the shape of your object done before you UV, is also the ideal there. The other thing that'll do really weird stuff, it's like all purple on the inside. The other thing that'll do really weird stuff to your UVs is doing like an append to polygon. So if I just add in a new face here, anytime you add an append to polygon, it makes a single gigantic UV shell that's like the entire size of your UV square. So like that would need to get scaled down and rotated to be some kind of better position. So just be aware of that. If you need to add, you can insert edge loops until the cows come home. But if you need to do anything with like extruding, or I'm actually not sure I've ever tried beveling on this, but I'm curious now. So if I did a Control B to bevel, Control B, okay, fine, edit mesh, bevel, okay. Beveling also sometimes does reasonable things. Like this side seems okay. But you can see up here, it did, I don't even know what this is. So this is like another thing where like do this before you finish finish your model before you UV it. Is always the best policy. But yeah, so I mean, if you need to do like a weird little sort of cabinet door texture, this is how I would do it. If you think about what you need before you actually start modeling, you can model in a way where your UVing and texturing will be significantly easier whenever you need to do that. Because again, now I don't need to go into Photoshop and have just start with like the square and then like manually cut out edges like this. I've done that. It's a huge pain in the ass. So now I just set up my UVs like this and I just chop up my model. Because in this case, I don't care if there's a seam here because I'd be manually adding one in Photoshop, and because it follows the exact geometry of the object, it's going to look a whole heck of a lot better than me trying to like fudge it in Photoshop, and it makes it easier to edit. It's just like, in my opinion, all around nicer. And I say again, if you should totally not have your UVs overlapping and doing all crazy stuff like this, if you need to add like a grime texture to this. Incidentally, this is what the layout looks like with an object with more objects in it. So sometimes it'll actually do really weird stuff, and it'll actually, okay, sometimes it would like change the layout of your object, but this one's not too bad. For stuff like faces and things, it does terrible, terrible job. But yeah, so hopefully that made sense.